This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the 23rd installment of the Enragé. This is your host, Eric Fleischman. Today we'll be joined by Ryan Neugebauer to discuss his article, Market, State, and Anarchy, a Dialectical Left-Libertarian Perspective. Ryan is a left-libertarian committed to the dialectical libertarian framework put forth by Chris Matthew Sciabarra, defending individual freedom and flourishing through the art of context keeping. Ryan supports subjecting all institutions and facets of society, the state, governance, economics, business, schooling, culture, etc., to critique and supporting more autonomy and less hierarchy in all areas of life, preferring bottom-up, decentralized, and non-hierarchical governance and coordination wherever possible. Ryan, thank you for coming on the Enragé.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. The audience will not realize it, but we started a few minutes ago, lost all the connection, and now we're starting again. So
it's not a big deal, but
no,
glad we're working now.
Yes, exactly. I can't tell you the number of times shit like that happens.
Oh yeah, it's just the things that we have to put up with technology.
It truly. But before we were chatting about the pronunciation of the Enragé, the pronunciation of your last name, of Chris Sciabarra's last name, and it led us to my first question, which is that you and I are both friends and in many ways students of Chris Matthew Sciabarra, or Sciabarra, depends on who's deciding, but his work on dialectical libertarianism. I'm curious, could you give a little background on how you met Chris and how he's influenced this piece and your work in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I met him or really got into his works at all, I was in my sophomore year of undergrad, and I went into the socialist, communist, anarchist section, and I was surprised I had that. There was a new book that was added to the shelf, and it was called Socialism After Hayek. And interesting piece of a socialist who takes Hayek's contributions very seriously. And he cites Chris at I think just one point in the book. It may be 2 points, but I remember at least one point in the book. And I was just like, oh, wow, this is interesting. He's talking about dialectical libertarianism. And I can't say I followed up much on it at that point, but it like the seed was there. And as time went on, going into 2015, I had read some essays by Kevin Carson where he was using Chris's framework. So I was getting a little bit more into it. And it was really not until 2017 that I both added Chris on Facebook and I read Marx, Hayek, Utopia and Total Freedom. I had not read his book, Ayn Rand, the Russian Radical, until honestly very recently, within like the last year or so. So that was like my introduction to his ideas, knowing who he is. And then our friendship kind of took off in 2018. I was having like a low point in my life, in May of 2018. And he had reached out. He'd wished me happy birthday that month. And we just started talking. And I reached out to him one time and asked him questions. And it just all kind of took off from there. As far as how he's influenced my thinking, his concept of dialectical libertarianism, I'm going to do my own little short version of it, but I say it involves defending individual freedom and flourishing through the art of context keeping, which that's how he defines dialectics, is the art of context keeping. That's his like short way of doing it. And I say, which involves analyzing issues related to freedom and flourishing through various vantage points. So it's not just enough to look at, is there more government regulation or less government regulation? We also have to look at the overall context of what's going on. A person who's applied this I think very well as well, was Kevin Carson in one of Chris's recent works, which included a mixture of writers called The Dialectics of Liberty. Carson takes this approach of looking at, well, sometimes what would look like an increase in statism or government control of some kind or another might actually be an overall net benefit for freedom given the context that exists. So we've got this bloated capitalist system. There's a lot of waste. There's a lot of people who are insulated from the damage that they cause, big time polluters and the like. And so we may not be comfortable with regulations as libertarians, from a state system, but given this, the overall context, it would be overall better to have some regulations that are at least checks on the abuses of these institutions, given that they continue to exist, rather than they continue to exist and there's no checks on them whatsoever. And so that's kind of, a very, we might even say, weak sauce introduction to the kind of core ideas and a little bit of an application of it. But that kind of thinking is what attracted me to Chris's ideas, because it seems so much more flexible. And having been someone who was an ANCAP for like 5 months, I know that doesn't sound very long, but it felt like an eternity when I was in it. The thing that like really just made me feel awful was that at the end of the day, the rigidity of it did not mesh well with my own personality and my own kind of, I guess, pull to try to find, I don't want to say the middle way in some kind of a weak way, but really truly finding a way that branches through extremes that don't seem like either of them really work out. So it's not, let's oppose something that sounds extreme for the sake of opposing something that sounds extreme, but rather, if two options are like on this, this, you think of like diametrically opposed on like some sort of a dichotomy, right? And you're not okay with either of them. You're like, neither of these really seem to achieve what they say they're going to achieve. I think they've got severe problems. It's like, okay, but what's the value that they have, and how might we combine those values into something superior to both of them? And so, yeah, I would say that's a good, maybe others wouldn't agree, but I think that's a good kind of explanation of the impact of those ideas on my thinking and why I was so pulled towards them.
Yeah, I mean, first, it's really funny you mentioned that you got to know Chris's work through Kevin Carson and Socialism After Hayek. It's exactly the same as me. That's the same trajectory. I read Kevin Carson's work on dialectical libertarianism, and then I read Socialism After Hayek, and then I messaged Chris and I photocopied him a picture of the citation, and I was like, "Is this you?"
Wow, I had no idea. Wow,
yeah, that's crazy. But what you're saying totally makes sense. It's this the interesting the unification of opposites is that very dialectical approach that, as opposed to like centrism, doesn't take the weakest aspects of both perspectives, but rather takes the strongest aspects and their ways they apply to real world contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested, that's dialectical libertarianism, taking that to, fight for freedom and flourishing. What is dialectical left libertarianism, which is the perspective that you take in this article?
That's right. Yeah. Good question. So, if we just think of libertarianism as most Americans would think of it, I think we could both be agreed that they're going to think about it in the kind of American right libertarian sense of some kind of a propertarianism of some form or another. It might be through a minarchist lens, like a Milton Friedman, or it could be through a more hardcore lens, like say a Walter Block, right? And this. I combine it together in this article. I could call it like free market propertarianism, where the only thing that's concerned for the person who's advocating for it is free market. So there's no regulations, at least nothing that would be like community enforced or a government enforced. And then this kind of very rigid conception of property ownership. Usually it's this idea of no proviso Lockeanism, where I in some process I mixed my labor and I obtained this land, and the no proviso part is it's irrelevant if after taking the amount of land I take, it leaves other people worse off. So just to give a little context there, In Anarchy, State, Utopia, the philosopher Robert Nozick back in the 1970s wrote that book. It was a big book when it came out. He comes up with the idea of the proviso and attributes it to Locke. There are people. Oh gosh, his name's escaping me right now. He wrote the book, I think, on atheism. He's a libertarian, just recently passed. Name's escaping me right now, but he argues that that Locke really didn't have this proviso thing. But essentially, somewhere Locke said that you needed to leave a certain amount for others, right? Because on that worldview, it's like, well, God created the earth for everyone, and so we don't want some people monopolizing all the land or taking more than they need. That leaves other people worse off, right? Some might critique the way I'm kind of sussing this out, but I think this is kind of the core of it. And so to say you're a no proviso Lockean would mean, well, no, like, how are you doing that? Like, are you saying then the community has some sort of control over individuals? Like they get to decide, whether an individual gets land or not. They don't get behind that. They see that as problematic. Roderick Long, who often writes for C4SS, has an article that he wrote for C4SS where he sketches out his view on that because he defends it, no proviso Lockeanism. And I love Roderick, and I think he's way more intelligent than I am. But I've read through his defenses of these views, and I don't see the force of it, quite honestly. So that essentially with the left libertarian, I'm trying to essentially highlight that I'm coming from a perspective that is egalitarian in nature. I am concerned about, if someone's taking more resources than someone else and it's leaving a lot of people worse off, that's not something I'm going to get behind, and I'm going to want to find some way to rectify it. How that's done is up to, question, of course. And we'll get to some of those questions later, I'm sure. But just on the face of it, a left libertarian is going to be concerned not just with kind of individual freedom as such, like the kind of the ability of an individual to do as they please, as long as they're not directly harming another person, but also concerned about, things like equality and, people not being oppressed by bosses and you might even say micro-authoritarianism, like very abusive parental situations and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I'm really putting left libertarian there, is to really emphasize the fact that I'm not defending the kind of right libertarian free market proprietarian framework.
That totally makes sense. Usually I ask people at this point to summarize the article, but I think I would like to just jump from that basis of dialectical left libertarianism. I think you gave a great summary to talk about just right into the questions on the article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good way to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's all about context, and I don't think that we can really talk about the dialectical left libertarian framework until we start talking about these contexts, the way it's used in the article itself.
Absolutely.
So the first thing you start off with your article is taking an assessment of the status quo, which you call liberal corporate capitalism. Mm-hmm. And some of the challenges that it might face from like alternative analyses. You start off with this sort of traditional left libertarian critique of liberal corporate capitalism as not being a free market, but rather markets are a feature of the system, but there's primarily about profit and regulatory capture. As you write, profit determines values and actions, and businesses work with the state and capture the state's regulatory agencies. A lot of people on the left would say that profit and state intervention are integral to markets themselves. I'm curious how you might respond to your analysis of the status quo.
Yeah. If I could write this article again on that part, one thing I would add, because I do agree with Kevin Carson on this issue, I don't want to minimize the degree to which markets are in fact a part of liberal corporate capitalism or the status quo. In fact, what Kevin would say is that capitalism, historically speaking, massively expands the cash nexus, which is the degree to which, in order to get by in life, you need to, make money and be able to, exchange on the market, compete on the market. So capitalism although markets have existed before it, and to respond to your question there, I would say, David Graeber, who's sort of an anarcho-communist, he's greatly missed. I'm sad that we lost him as soon as we did. But, he would argue markets have always existed in some form or another. What capitalism does, though, is it massively increases specific forms of markets, right? We've seen the rise of very, very interesting financial markets, right, and how they've played out in the 21st century with the '08 crisis. Like real estate and all these other types of markets. And so it's not my contention that markets aren't important. It's just, first of all, they're not free. And I think we can all agree about that. It's a highly regulated system. And if we take Gabriel Coco's work, who's a new leftist during that new left period of the 60s and 70s, we would see that it's often in favor of big business and concentrated elites. Even if it looks like on the surface it's supposed to address, issues we'd all like to see addressed, like environmental concerns and unfair practices and stuff like that. But it's not a free market in the way that, say, right libertarians or even left market anarchists would conceptualize free markets. So that's kind of where I come down on it. As far as profit and the state are concerned, they absolutely play a major role in markets as we see today. I would say that they don't play an equal role in all markets the same way, right? I might say tech markets are freer than like healthcare markets are. You could say that even healthcare markets might be a little bit freer than like militaristic markets, and not necessarily for weapons, but it could be other things that the military is after, aircraft, seating and toilets, all that stuff, right? Yeah. I would just say it's probably if we're keeping with context keeping, it's quote unquote contextual, right? But on the whole, there aren't really any free markets. Now, I would like to write an article at some point talking about how I actually don't think the concept of free market is very helpful, because it seems to be an ideal that's not actually achievable, or at least I don't even necessarily think preferable, depending on what we mean by it. I more like the concept of freer markets or freed markets. There's some active process going on to make them free. They don't just pop out of a vacuum and haha, they're free. Does that answer your question, or do you have? I kind of went all over the place there. So if there's any clarifying questions, I'd love to answer them.
No, that perfectly answered my question. I think I'm of very much the same opinion that even as I often use the rhetoric of free markets, I don't think that there's much use in describing the free market as opposed to particular context, particular markets in particular situations.
Right. You could have a slave market, and do we really care whether it's quote unquote free or not? Are there too much regulations in the slave market? It's I don't want there to be a slave market. So who cares, right? So
it's really a question of markets as a tool. Markets are very helpful for certain things, but then when everything is all-purpose cash market, a lot of things are devalued from their in a sort of commodified sense.
Yeah, and some things may not work as well on a market level, which is something that Eleanor Ostrom would point out. She'd be actually, I think there are contexts where both the state or some kind of a centralized approach and a kind of proprietarian market approach are not optimal, and some form of communal regulatory approach would be preferable from the bottom up. So.
Yeah, totally. And I think we're going to get into Ostrom a little later, but I first want to talk about the two traditional challenges that you identify to liberal corporate capitalism and its not so free market. The two traditional challenges, you've mentioned one already, free market proprietarianism, and the other one is state socialism. Free market proprietarianism is, as you assess, quote, a framework that reduces everything in society to owning private property and engaging in market relations without regulations, which is what we just talked about a second ago. But you point out that both the left libertarian and the right libertarian hope that this will spontaneously emerge into either worker co-ops and mutual credit systems or more hierarchy and exploitation, misses some of the points that there needs to be some kind of quote unquote authority to establish property norms or push markets into pro-social directions. Mm-hmm. You say, we can quibble about what counts as authority. And so I kind of want to quibble a little bit. I'm curious, what is authority to you, and what makes one authority legitimate over any other in, establishing certain types of property systems, in, like we said, freeing markets, doing this process of freeing markets?
Yeah, no, that's the great question. You could almost call him Mr. Addendum, because I always feel I have to add some kind of addendum or proviso to something. I wouldn't say all left libertarians have this issue. It's just that there are some in particular, I think, especially of kind of a rigid individualist anarchist bent, that tend to fall into this more. That might get more apparent as I answer this question further. But, I think it's so, for example, anarcho-communist might have an idea of you have some sort of a bottom-up, communal arrangement that kind of decides how resources go where they go, right? And they would say, we wouldn't want something else to do that in our society, right? And some people would say, cool, that's a form of anarchism. There's no authority involved. But you might get an individualist anarchist who would respond and say, well, why isn't the community an authority? An authority doesn't have to be a single person, right? It could be some kind of a mechanism that asserts itself, right? And such as long as there's some standard in a geographic area, you could be splitting hairs. I don't know. I don't claim to know the right answer on this. That's why I'm pretty flexible in the article. But I guess that's where I come down. It's if someone wants to say that is an authority, then it becomes a little bit more difficult in getting on board fully with, say, maybe that specific form of anarchism. Now, I don't think it counts really as a critique, because Proudhon, the first self-described anarchist, defended the agro-industrial federation, some kind of a mechanism by which people kind of, what would you say, associate themselves with, and that created standards and stuff. And you had you might say you had various local regions that would work together, and there may be a more central mechanism that they work through. It just it was not like a top-down imposition, if that makes sense. And if someone says that's not an authority, cool, great. But if someone says it is, now we're going to have that debate. And that's my contention partially in this article, is I don't think a lot of anarchists fully flesh out what counts or what doesn't count. And I'm not claiming to be the arbiter of that debate. But I would love to see even C4SS have a discussion on that in particular. So now, could you ask the last part of the question? Because I think I'm missing something, and I know I had more to say. So
my end bit was, I think you kind of covered it, but what makes one authority more legitimate than any other?
There you go. I knew I was missing something. So obviously in anarchism, you want to oppose at least the kind of authorities that are imposed, right? Because anarchism is basically contra to authority, without ruler, right? So, but at the same time, you get someone like Bakunin, right? Mikhail Bakunin, who talked about the authority of the bootmaker, right? So, you have someone who's, let's just say, a skilled professional at making boots, and I kind of give in to their authority on making boots. I'm not supervising them. I just trust that they know what they're doing, and I'm going to leave the bootmaking to them. I guess unless I become a bootmaker myself, right? And so that's a form of authority that most anarchists aren't concerned with. But then also many would say, but I don't consider that an authority, period. So I wouldn't want to call it an authority. So I don't know. I think if it's the case that things like even what Proudhon defended count as an authority, like we have that debate and it's sorry, no, that counts as an authority, then I would just say then, okay, I think some kind of an organizational mechanism, given that still counts as an authority, would be legitimate for the purposes of, being able to more adequately, run the kind of society that we want, get materials where they need to go, ensure that people are respected for who they are, whether they're trans and non-binary, gay, religious of some form or another. The long list of things that we're concerned about getting oppressed. I could see having some organized mechanism ensuring that it's the case. Ideal, even though it would not be in the form of, say, a modern nation state or even your typical local government. But I think still answering that part about legitimate authority is still difficult, given the previous thing I said about, but like, what even counts? And if you ask different anarchists, you're going to get different answers. And so there are forms of anarchism that are strictly against organization, period, I'm sure you're aware of. And so they would say that that's unjust. It's too likely to go into, something much more authoritarian than maybe it started out, or it's more prone to getting captured, whatever the case may be. They would prefer like just some very, very micro level kind of combative, competitive arrangement where it's like the ANCAPs have their private competing courts over here. You have your little commune over here. Like, it's very, very small. Like, we're not even talking like a 50,000 person local government. We're talking about, well, looks like we got 1,000 people over here and they got their little thing. And then they find a way to interact with these people with a completely different system. Like, that seems to be the kind of thing that some of these people defend. And if you're an anarchist, you can't prevent that from happening, but you can certainly have a preference for how you'd like it to go. And you would have to actively cultivate in your own area the kind of system that you think will actually, achieve the ends that you're hoping for. I don't think that's the most satisfactory answer, but it's because I don't think this is fully fleshed out. And that's kind of what my article is. It's not a final answer on anything. It's really a springboard for us to really discuss these ideas and figure out what is the best way forward. And maybe not even best, but the better way forward, given the constraints that we face.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like you're touching upon this tension that's been in anarchism for such a long time. I think Murray Bookchin is probably the most explicit in sort of this difference between what he calls lifestyle anarchism versus social anarchism. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I really like Bookchin, but I also think he can be a bit over the top in his condemnation of everything that isn't like immediate community.
Yeah.
But I will say that it's a question of like, some anarchists will take the individual as the beginning and the end of everything. And the point of an anarchist is to just resist everything around you, which is totally valid. But then there's another kind of understanding of anarchism, which is the shifting of institutional responsibility towards like voluntary structures that people have cooperative control over, that people have control over their lives and their local communities. And I think
jump in maybe when you're done.
Yeah, wait, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure because you have a lot of good stuff here and it's sparking my brain's having the light bulb moment shooting off.
Go ahead.
Something no problem. Something I talked with an old friend from high school yesterday about. He's studying philosophy. Actually, he's studying philosophy with Jason Lee Bias up in Michigan. Interesting.
Oh, wow.
So it was so cool that a high school friend crossed paths with an online friend. But one of the things that I said, and I think it unsettles a lot of libertarians and anarchists, is that there's this tension between individualism and what we might call as collectivism or community of some form or another. It could be in the form of some kind of family, whether it's the nuclear family that we know more modern wise, or the extended family or tribal relations, right? And I don't mean
family.
What's that?
The queer family.
The queer, yeah. And when I said tribal, I didn't mean that in like a negative sense. I meant like an actual legitimate tribe. But I don't think you get out of that though, because, and this is interesting because I was raised Catholic, and something that I still hold to a little bit is, Catholicism rejects the claim that the individual is the basic unit of society, because individuals don't pop out of a vacuum, right? They're socialized in the context. Like you don't come out of the birth canal as a full individual thinking and going, I'm fighting the system, right? You're raised and developed in some kind of context, whether that's a commune or a nuclear family, an extended family, a tribe, what have you. It's some sort of collectivity that you're raised in. At the same time, once we develop and we are full individuals, our freedom and autonomy matter, right? And and if we're going to be flourishing, a collective can be very abusive towards the individual, right? And so at the same time that the individual depends on the collective to help them develop and so that they can flourish, they're not just this atomistic being that's like bumping around and like trying to figure out, oh gosh, I guess I have to gather wood in the forest as a single, single unit. They have a greater collective that they can lean on and that they contribute to. And I think that's healthy. I think that the ideal is you want a healthy collective that allows individuals to flourish, right? But you've always got to be alert to the abuses of community and such, because we've seen that in communes over the history of someone who takes advantage of the fact that maybe there isn't money and some sort of social credit starts to take the place of money. Like, oh, I'm the most adept at argument, and I can rise up the kind of hierarchical ladder that just kind of can naturally come about sometimes, and you can get some unfortunately very abusive dynamics there. I don't want to go too into it because some of that can get very, I think, triggering for people. But I think you know what I mean. And so, I don't think you can completely resolve the tension between individual and collective, but a dialectical left-libertarian approach and an anarchist approach is going to seek to do that as best it can, but it's always going to be an ongoing dynamic relationship. And I think that goes with the kind of the dialectical framework as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's the advantage of the dialectical framework, is that we live in a world that is not really as it appears. Things appear to be binary, things appear to be opposites, things appear to be, contradictory. But in reality, things that appear to be opposites actually constitute each other, just in the same way that individuals constitute communities and communities constitute individuals, and they also contradict each other, and they also have tensions between them. And I think it's I can't remember who I read the other day, but it was basically saying to prioritize the individual over the collective, or the collective over the individual, is like trying to prioritize the egg over the chicken, or the chicken over the egg.
I like that. I'd love to know who that is whenever you find out, because that's
I will. I'll look it up. But I think that that's really the advantage of the approach, is it's seeing things that on the surface appear to be clear opposites, but are actually mutually constituting each other. And in that way, give a greater sense of context when you look at, who is this person? Where are they? Who are they? What are they?
Mm-hmm. I think, and this may not be a good analogy, but I'm going to try it. I can get frustrated with my car because it seems that tires can be very prone to getting nails stuck in them and rocks, that might smash them pretty hard and cause issues. Like wheels, tires, the whole bit, right, is actually very prone to weakness and having issues and such. But it wouldn't be a car without the wheels, right? Mm-hmm. And so we seek to find better ways to make wheels, and okay, I need to avoid that rut in the road, and if it looks like it's very flooded, I might not want to drive through it. You have to adapt, but you can't get around the fact that you still need the wheels if you're going to have a car. And obviously, we could critique car culture, but that's not really the point of the analogy, right? So I think the individual collective is very much the same way. It's like, and actually, Chris uses this example a lot with his dissertation advisor, the Marxist Bertel Ullman, how he goes, libertarians a lot of times are like, the person who goes into the Chinese restaurant and says, I want to order pizza. It's like, it's not on the menu, you're demanding something that's just not even in the realm of options. So I think that's very much the case with kind of community and collectives, is that you're not going to get around that if you're going to have some form of flourishing society. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you just put up with whatever form it takes. I don't think we want to say, oh, I guess you had to put up with the way Nazi Germany went, or the way the Jim Jones cult went. It's like, no, we want to push against problematic structures and relations. But the idea that an individual is going to be within some kind of collective that might at times put some demands on the individual, I don't think you can get around that.
Mm-hmm. And one of the premier thinkers in that sort of tension of community and individuals and the sort of basic is Elinor Ostrom, who who demonstrates that, if you reduce everything to markets and property and like sort of basically ignore people, you get a pretty unhelpful vision of the world. You mention Ostrom in your piece as sort of an indicator that free market proprietarianism doesn't extend to the limits that it needs to be ultimately like the premier critique of liberal corporate capitalism. But at the same time, many left libertarians would counter that commons and commonly held property are part of freed markets, as part of markets, since it involves voluntary transaction and non-state governance. I'm curious because I've had this debate with people a lot. Do you think that is an accurate assessment, that commons are part of the market, or is that strains the definition of market and property too far?
Yeah, I'd be more likely to take the latter approach. I mean, I think if you say markets, like for example, this is usually how it goes. You'll get this from like the voluntarists. They'll say everything voluntary, right? And everything that's voluntary is markets. And it's like, well, then what's the use of the concept of market? You might as well just say voluntary interaction then, right? Because like a market takes this very specific form, like you had mentioned earlier. Like it's kind of like a tool, right? Typically, we have prices involved in a market. That was kind of Hayek's focus when he talked about the use of knowledge in society, is that prices are like signals and they help us to be able to best address the knowledge problem, the fact that knowledge is dispersed among all kinds of unique individuals, and a centralized authority would struggle to kind of aggregate and get an assessment of all that information that's sort of ever changing, and that's why the central authority would fail to adequately centrally plan everything, right? So markets involve certain components that make the markets. And once you go, oh, actually, those components don't matter, it actually includes everything that's voluntary, it's like, I really don't buy into that. Now, I think you can have markets and a commons, and that's fine. Like I tend to think that any advanced modern society is going to have some markets involved. I mean, that's why I don't necessarily consider myself, say, a communist. I'm not hostile to communism, but given that communism would oppose markets typically, I think that given that I think markets would necessarily be involved in advanced modern society until such a time as evidence comes to the fray that it's not, it would be alongside some form of commons, because I think the commons is very, very important. So yeah, I would agree with the final part of that statement, which would say that I think it stretches the definition to a point where market really has no use at all, and I do really think that there is a separation between the two.
Yes, and for the audience, if you're interested in more left libertarian debates around the commons, check out Center for Stateless Society's anthology, The Anatomy of Escape. It's a great book on just different perspectives from a market anarchist view on commons. So we've covered the issues with free market proprietarianism, but the other opposing analysis to liberal corporate capitalism is state socialism, which, as opposed to proprietarians that go toward property and away from the state socialists go towards the state and away from private property. The two forms you identify of state socialism, and I think these are pretty commonly understood to be the sort of preeminent forms right now, are democratic socialism and Marxist-Leninism. I'm not sure our listeners really need a lot to convince them that Marxist-Leninism is unhelpful at best, nightmarish at worst, and especially for me as somewhat of an autonomous Marxian, a corruption of the sort of important ideas of Marx. But for the sake of covering the extent of your piece, you want to outline a couple of problems with Marxist-Leninism, especially in its challenge to liberal corporate capitalism?
Yeah. So I'll just give like a little bit brief overview of it. Marxist-Leninists would be opposed to like anarchism, obviously, and but they also would be opposed to kind of democratic socialism because they oppose liberal democracy, and essentially that they hold that there needs to be what they call a vanguard party, right? And it's through this kind of democratic centralism. There's a centralized process going on where this party seizes power, and they seize it on behalf of the workers, right? And they establish this one-party socialist state that would be called the dictatorship of the proletariat under their framework. And essentially, the nation state would then control the means of production. It would be squashing capitalism in the process, and then eventually pave the way for a communist society that's classless and stateless. So it's like a flick of the magic wand, and suddenly that big state that just centralized everything is going to be like, okay, enough of that. It's time for the statelessness. I'm being a little bit, kind of what's the word, cheeky maybe, but that's not that far off from the way that they would describe it, right?
It's more fair to them than they are to us.
Yeah, and I really do think steel manning is important, and I think that getting their position in the strongest form is important. And that's typically what I'm told by Marxist Leninists. Like, it's not that far off. So, I mean, you were talking about, like, where does that go wrong? Well, I mean, from an anarchist standpoint, it's like, we already have issues with liberal democracy, but like now you want it even less accountable, the nation state, where you have this single party that doesn't even have to face elections. It doesn't have to face any opposition at all. It's just whoever is in the party controlling the apparatus makes the decisions for everyone, which is why it's not surprising that in practice it includes suppressing people who don't agree on any number of issues. Unfortunately, in some cases, killing people off. Because if it's so important for you to be the one with the reins, you can't let anyone wrestle those reins away from you. And so it becomes kind of a bloody thing. And so, yeah, I very much opposed to that. Obviously, I just spoke earlier about issues with centralization kind of period. So let's just say we had absolute, the best people you could imagine, going in and being the party. So let's say that we have, Eric Fleischman, and Eric Fleischman is going to replicate, right? And you're going to now be like 100 people in the party, and it's just you, right? And you've got the reins, and you're doing all these decisions. You're still going to face the problem of figuring out, like, what does everybody want? And no, it doesn't seem that computers solve the problem there. I think C4SS has a few articles that kind of address that cybernetic communism or socialism approach of, well, we'll just have computers calculate everything. It's like, well, people's wants and needs are ever changing, and putting you as a person who does not have a synoptic view, a total view of everything, in control, and having to look through all the data that doesn't interpret itself and make decisions, like that is that's concerning. Because even if you're a good person, you can make a lot of mistakes in the process of that. People make mistakes who are good-hearted on a local government level, let alone a massive nation-state level. And I could say a lot more on that, but just to say, like, that, those are some of the issues that I have with it. Both that in reality it becomes a very brutal system, but even if we could think through ideal people being a part of it, which is what rarely ever happens, Hayek talks about the worst get on top, right? And I think that's often true. Even in that case, they're going to face problems that would be, it would not lead to very good and efficient outcomes for everybody else. If we're going to talk about what about if it's not the left who somehow gets the power, it's right wing. Well, just wait for the right wing to decide, yeah, actually, we're going to ban, across the board, trans affirming care. And if you don't think they'll do it, I don't know what realm, I don't know what realm you're living in. Right. So yeah, I hope I've answered the question, but if there are any other follow-ups, like, please, yeah, just let me know.
I mean, I think you covered it pretty well. I definitely agree. I mean, first of all, call me Chairman Eric going forward.
Yeah. People call me sometimes jokingly Comrade Brian, because they know I'm like, my name's Ryan. It's not Brian. They're like, okay, Comrade Brian. So it's a kind of running joke now.
Yeah. But I think it's really interesting, the mentioning, the issues of Hayekian knowledge problems, which I really think are one of the best insights that market anarchism brings to this sort of anti-capitalist conversations. But I also think your thing on cybernetic communism, I'm very suspicious of claims that we can just sort of like AI or supercomputer our way out of a calculation problem, particularly because it's people designing the systems in the first place. So it's going to have, just in the same way that you see all these new AI technologies, like being horribly racist or like being, or even like stuff used in courts that were like AI being like racially biased because racially biased people created it. It sort of like sidesteps the issue that it's people, just in the same way people are in context, so too are technology. Technology is reliant on its own context.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The strongest form of that argument says, let's take the kind of computerized supply chains that you see with, say, a Walmart or an Amazon, and then let's just wrestle the control of it, and then we'll use that for our own means. So we'll get the need for money out of the way, and then people just make their requests on the site, and you're kind of having to compete for the goods because there's still not going to be an unlimited amount of goods, right? It's not like you've abolished scarcity, but like, I guess you would just have to wait until it restocked, I guess. But I'm not the best at arguing on that because I haven't looked enough into it. But people who know a lot better on that issue and still hold to some of my Hayekian critiques, like, no, that hasn't solved the problem. And so I still need to look into it more, but it still doesn't get around the issues that you just described about, like, well, someone still designed that software and it's a person, right? So,
yeah. Well, we've covered Marxist-Leninism. I don't think much more needs to be said. This is, after all, a left-libertarian anarchist podcast. The much more appealing form of state socialism that you cover is democratic socialism, which is, I think a lot of people in left-libertarian and anarchist circles come from democratic socialist backgrounds or have a lot of sympathy for that position. However, you outline three main problems. That one, it is, quote, not likely to sidestep class dynamics. Two, it, quote, tends to be too comfortable with nationalization and planning. And three, quote, there is an overemphasis on collectivization and community control. We kind of talked about extensively the matter of nationalization and planning. So I'm curious about the issue of sidestepping class dynamics, particularly because socialists claim that's exactly what they're trying to do, and the overemphasis on community control, because we've also talked about the importance but also danger of community. So I was wondering if you could expand and outline on those problems in democratic socialism.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say the class dynamic point was something that in my discussions with Chris Sciabarra, like, he very much emphasized, and I agreed with the kind of the critiques he was making. I think it's fair to say, even if you look at the former Soviet Union, which obviously is not a representative of democratic socialism, there was a class elite. There was an elite at the top that was, gathering resources for themselves, and other people had to struggle to kind of work around them to get any little bit of scraps that they could for themselves. It's why black markets were so massive in the Soviet Union, and probably actually helped it go along as much as it did. But in a democratic socialist framework, it also depends on, like, how far did you go, right? So, like, a democratic socialist, like, say, or self-described democratic socialist, like, say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's in New York, or Bernie Sanders from Vermont, for them, it's like, well, as long as we have the post office and we have a national healthcare system, a single payer healthcare system, we limit markets in certain areas, that would still be a form of socialism, even if workers don't control the means of production. In that sense, it's like, but you really haven't gotten rid of the capitalist class. You're just kind of hyper-regulating them more than, say, the typical liberal progressive is. And certainly more philosophical democratic socialists would critique those. They would still support it and be like, I'd rather that state of affairs than not. But they would say, you got to go further than that. And if you're able to somehow achieve, while the nation state exists, workers will control the means of production, and you get rid of the sort of the capitalist class, then I guess maybe you've been able to get around it that way. But it still begs the question of, what about those who are controlling the state apparatus and the control that they have over the workers? There's still going to be, a differential there, and all kinds of, I think, problems with that. Going with what we've talked about earlier, that still applies. So I think that's kind of what I'm talking about, is like, unless you eliminate these mechanisms, like, I don't see how you've gotten around that as a problem. Chris might have more to say and probably better ways of putting it than me. But I think that's at least going in that direction of tackling that problem.
Yeah, I think democratic socialism really struggles. In many ways, I would say Marxist-Leninism almost has a better critique of the state, at least in theory, than democratic socialism does, because at least in the sort of theoretics, Lenin is saying the state dissolves, whereas the democratic socialist sort of takes the state as the given. But of course, in practice, both situations end up establishing pretty strong states that aren't able to, that are both subject to like bad people getting in charge, but also just like we've talked before, the basic issues of like trying to plan, and to adapt to specific local contexts.
I would add also with the point that you made on Marxist-Leninism, one of the things that the Marxist-Leninists will point out is like, that's the big problem, is that, a democratic socialist framework within a liberal democratic system is actually going to struggle to achieve what it wants because the capitalist class have so much sway. And so that's why the Marxist-Leninists go, no, we need to have a dictatorship of the proletariat through this, seizing of power, and I don't think they mean that in a peaceful way. Most of them don't see that is going to be a bloodless approach. Like there's going to be violence, in seizing it. And like we've seen how that's gone down in many different cases over the last 100+ years. So yeah, but I think that's one of the things that the Marxist-Leninists are kind of, at least they're paying attention to, is like, it's not very easy to fight the capitalist system, actually. And so that's one of the things that democratic socialists are going to struggle with, is actually finding a way to win those majorities, I guess, of the public and actually take the reins. I do recall there was a YouTube video I listened to a while back. It involved Ben Burgess, who considers himself both a Marxist and I think a democratic socialist. He was with a couple of other people, and they were talking about how one of the big barriers, especially in the United States, is the military-industrial complex. You think the CIA and the military apparatus, is that it will resist you very, very greatly in terms of trying to establish something like that, because the militarized system is not going to want to see any reduction of its capacities. And a democratic socialist movement, if it's a true one and it actually got some foothold into the system, would be a threat. So I think the Marxist-Leninists know enough to say, ooh, that's going to be difficult in that system. But then they approach something like so horrific that it's like, who wants that,
Yeah. It basically acknowledges the problem and then says we should make the problem worse.
Yeah.
That's how we get through it.
Yeah.
I also want to touch upon your critique of local collectivization and community control, because we've talked about the limits of markets, the importance of commons, but you ultimately, and like the relationship of community and individual. What are the issues of collectivization and community control, especially in the context of democratic socialism?
Yeah. So typically when I'm thinking about this, I'm not necessarily thinking about it in the context of like democratic socialism as such, like in terms of like the movement's gotten control of a liberal democratic nation state, and so it's controlling things from a centralized apparatus. I'm thinking more of like a bottom-up collective, which would be something that we'd want to be concerned with, say, anarcho-communism and other kind of collectivist orientations of anarchism, which is, if a community, it has a lot of sway on resources and such, doesn't even have to eliminate markets completely, although there obviously are forms that do, like anarcho-communism. That community, depending on its prevailing values, could be very oppressive to minorities, right? So let's say that you're in an area that is much more conservative, right? And I don't think there's any reason to think that socialism prevails and that rids us of all reactionary identities, because I think we find even a lot of leftists still have that, even if it's not exactly conscious all the time. But they could be very oppressive towards that minority, and like, oh, you want healthcare? Well, you better do what we say, because we're not going to give it to you. And it doesn't even have to be in the sense of like this apparatus passed some kind of a legal, decree or something like that said that they couldn't have healthcare. It could just be everyone's like, we don't associate with people who are like you, and now you're kicked out. And that's a problem. And that kind of goes back to that tension of individual and collective, where we're always going to have to be alert to these kind of concerns. And you cannot guarantee that those concerns won't come up in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't have to be through a typical like, oh, I don't like someone who is trans or gay or someone who's African American or indigenous or whatever. I mean, it could also be, I don't like people who have this particular opinion. And it could be on something completely what might seem trivial, like, oh, well, you didn't have this position on the Bolsheviks when they took power. And, we consider you, not a true revolutionary, and not true revolutionaries. You don't get to take part in the, the collective goods that we've all developed, right? Whether or not this is likely to happen or not, people could probably say that sounds goofy, but it's just to say that kind of stuff does happen because people can be really irrational. And so, I'll stop there and just see if you have some good follow-ups that might push us further in that direction.
I don't know if I have any great follow-ups. I think you're touching upon it really well. I think the sort of points you're making lend themselves to points that like Kathy Reisenwitz makes or Chris makes about the ways in which like things that aren't necessarily government are also threats to individual freedom, like racism, transphobia, sexism.
Right.
But I more want to move on to we've covered the two main critiques you talk about: state socialism, critiques of the status quo, state socialism, and free market proprietarianism. And you ultimately conclude, because of the reasons we've talked about, that neither one of these are like effective solutions.
Right.
And that the way forward is anarchism. And you say that, I'm like, yes. But what to you is anarchism? And why to you does it provide the best challenge to the status quo?
Yeah. So I would give maybe, here comes Mr. Addendum again, right? A little bit of an addendum there. So I say the way forward is a dialectical left-libertarian one, which may include anarchism in reality, but at least as an ideal to shoot for, right? So, I'm a very agnostic-oriented person. I'm very careful with making big claims. I have a lot of skepticism and cautiousness and such like that. So I may have a preference for something, but that doesn't mean I have full confidence and certainty that it can actually come about, right? But I connect individual freedom and flourishing to opposition to oppression of all kinds, including authoritarian micro-relations. And I think anarchism as an ideology best takes that into account in a comprehensive way. So, I said earlier, anarchism is, without rulers, right? It's oftentimes, referred to as a society without state rule. And as I say in my article, it's generally a social and political ideology advocating, a society that does not use coercive forms of authority, right? So kind of going back to our previous topic on authority, if it turns out that the kind of things we talked about with having some form of organizations in a what we would call a stateless society, right? If those count as authorities, like if we hash out that debate and they count as authorities, then it may just be that like a pure form of anarchism that's even against those, isn't maybe ideal or possible. But we could get something so maximally in that direction that, it still works, but it's like, oh, we still have this thing that technically counts as authority, but people are free and flourishing and no one's getting oppressed and, it's A-okay, right? So that kind of does get back to that debate about what counts as authority or not. But, this oftentimes comes from my cautiousness. But I think William Gillis, who writes for C4SS, and has, I believe, a higher up position at C4SS.
There's no hierarchy at C4SS.
you know what I mean? It's not like someone like me who just writes articles, but actually like takes a stake in the organization as it is. But
my boyfriend the other day was like mentioning someone at C4SS, Logan Glitterbaum, and was like, "She's your boss, right?" I was like, "What? Nobody's my boss."
Right. But I think Gillis put it beautifully. And this is in my article. I know there's a big issue with reading things verbatim, but I do think it does such a good job. So I'm going to do it. Gillis states, anarchism is more sweeping and more ambitious than any of the political platforms it is often compared with. As you can see, we can never make a simple list of demands because our aspirations are ultimately infinite. By declaring ourselves for the abolition of rulership itself, We have created a space for striving. The furthest particulars will always be unsettled. Anarchism does not represent a final state of affairs, but a direction, a vector pointing beyond all possible compromises. And I love that. I think that's what it is. It is that arrow, it is that ideal point that we're all moving to. And it has so many multifaceted concerns. And so we're constantly moving in that direction. Whether or not we ever get to a point that we could call as pure anarchist society, it's perfectly anarchist, whatever that means, I don't know. And there are people who would critique me for that. But I'm down for the pursuit, right? So I think that's what kind of really sums it up for me.
So we've kind of covered this pretty much in the question you just answered about, why anarchism over, anything else, because it provides this like uncompromising vector towards human freedom and flourishing. But I am curious as to why you might avoid other decentralist terms that would more match up with like what you say, like a constitution or constitution-like framework to help establish property norms, like communalism or citizenism or municipalism. What is it that keeps you identifying as an anarchist? Is it just that infinite vector of possibilities?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's that I don't want to settle, and I don't want to claim just because we don't have high confidence in something, or we just don't know because something hasn't been tried, that we then know the limits of something. But rather that, look, we should go as far as we can, and if we reach some kind of impasse or some strictures that we can't move beyond, we can go, well, we got a hell of a lot better than we were, not that long ago, right? Like we've moved so much better off than we were before. So yeah, it's like, look, I think kind of like, Kevin Carson wrote that article on libertarian municipalism, and it was like, oh gosh, what was it? Something for like post-capitalist transition, network cities for post-capitalist transition, something like that. And I think that could work great as a transitory. Like we move in that direction, and then we go further. And the thing that would stop me from saying, "Oh, I'm just a mere libertarian municipalist" or something like that, is that I don't want to put the limits. I don't want to say we couldn't go further than that. And I'd like to see if we can go as far as we can. So yeah, I think you were on to kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is really it misses. No, your point doesn't miss. It catches what the debate between like communalism or democratic confederalism and anarchism is, which is that certainly there's two sides of it. That there's a limit to how far the idea of communalism can go. Like Rojava, for example, is not a stateless society necessarily. It's just a very decentralized governance structure, and we could maybe do more, but that doesn't mean that we should dismiss that as a legitimate and important project, which is what some anarchists say. They're not engaging the proper class struggle. They're not properly, abolishing the state. But I think that dichotomy between the pure anarchist and the democratic confederalist misses the point that we're all aiming towards human freedom, and anyone who probably isn't worth working with. But you shouldn't just critique something because it isn't meeting the absolute ideal. Because things are real, things are context. They're not just ideals.
Right. And show me where you've achieved the ideal, right? So if someone's like, oh, I don't like them because they haven't achieved the ideal. It's like, okay, so what have you achieved? And if you haven't even gone as far as they have, it's like, that doesn't mean you can't critique them, especially where it's legitimate. But oftentimes it's like, and I do think there is something to the saying, like, you just made the perfect the enemy of the good. Like, you're not even allowing us to get better because you want us to go from this very imperfect state to perfection right away. And everything that falls short of that is like, screw it. We don't want anything to do with it. I'm going to throw my fist up in the air against it. And that's what I'm trying to fight against. I don't see it as helpful. And I don't think any improvement that's come about has come about that way. There have been voices that have to compete. Like some people are a little too reformist. And so you got other people who check them with maybe a little bit more idealism. But there's a very dynamic dance that goes on. And I think that dynamic dance is important.
For sure. Well, that's the main section of questions. I do have two additional questions I wanted to get into if you still have time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The first one is, so you mentioned how, it's all about context. It's all about, what fits a particular context to encourage freedom and flourishing, like Kevin Carson's libertarian municipalism, or in the article you talk a little bit about Georgism and like land value tax. But one sort of decentralist ideology you mentioned that I'm surprised doesn't get more attention at C4SS is distributism. I'm curious because I know you have a little bit of background in that thinking. What is distributism? What's its appeal, and what is your background in that sort of project?
Yeah, absolutely. So, distributism came about in the 19th century, which makes sense around the time that you had ideas like socialism and anarchism really, kind of springing forth. And distributism was trying to be a response to the kind of socialism versus capitalism dichotomy that was going on back in the 19th century, right? So the kind of key perspective is that ownership of the means of production should be as widespread as possible, rather than concentrated either in the hands of capitalist owners or in the hands of state bureaucrats, which they would identify with socialism. Now, the way this kind of looks to me is it almost looks like some kind of a decentralist mutualism, but that has some Catholic baggage to it because it was Catholic thinkers who kind of brought it to the forefront, right? So I like it, though, because it does have some of that flexibility. It doesn't necessarily inherently oppose having a government. So that means that, we could maybe implement some of its policies with the system we have now, just like in the short run. There's that flexibility, right? But there were also anarchists who took on those views. Like Dorothy Day was at one time, I think she considers herself a full-on communist, but due to her Catholicism, she ended up embracing, what you might call as like a anarcho-distributism. And it has that, some of the Catholicism that's in a lot of it is, this love for community and family, and small production. So it's like you've got your house and you're raising your family, and you've got your local community there, and everyone's kind of like supporting each other. And there's a sustainability to it, and it's not just like your property's all controlled by the state or by some collective. And at the same time, you're not, oppressed by like capitalist owners who control everything either. And so there's aspects to that that's nice. I think a lot of classical distributists are quite right-wing, reactionary in their social values. That's where I kind of detract from them. There are kind of like neo-distributists in the mid-late 20th century that kind of arise, who take some of those ideas but shed some of that kind of conservative religious baggage, if you might say. But I kind of got exposed to it when I was engaging with a lot of these ideas for the first time, like mutualism and anarchism and socialism and all that stuff. This was one of the ones that I saw, and I think there are a lot of writers, even modern day, like John Liddell. I may not be pronouncing his name correctly, but he lives in, I believe, the Dallas area, and he writes a lot about distributism. And he has a book, I think, called Towards a Truly Free Market. And it's kind of like a distributist response to all these different issues that we talk about. And then Kevin's had a lot of interactions with him over the years too. So I think it's just another, ideological kind of perspective out there that has writers who have some good local sustainability perspectives that can be helpful in both the short term, and maybe they have some ideas that could help in the long term too. So yeah.
Great. Yeah. No, it's really funny. I went to get my shoes repaired because I'm a localist, and I ran into a distributive Catholic shoemaker who and yeah, we had like a whole conversation about theology and distributism, but it sort of was the same thing, because even as we were talking about it, and we're talking about, oh yeah, it's great to be decentralized, it's great to have all these different things, I was concerned about bringing up like the fact that I had a boyfriend, or the fact that I am non-binary, and because like even as it has these sort of decentralist economic aspects, there is that sort of element of Catholicism, and maybe it's just because I'm like a raging Protestant, but like I always sort of resist that sort of hierarchical collectivism that you see in Catholicism. My last question, you mentioned the left and right divide both generally and within libertarianism. You argue that the political left, quote, has overwhelmingly stagnated in the stasis of the welfare regulatory state, while at the same time you're extremely skeptical of the, quote, right libertarians' prescription to privatize everything and see markets as a panacea for everything. Mm-hmm. One of the debates raging right now, I say debates raging, it's me just arguing with other people at C4SS, is within left-wing market anarchism, neo-mutualism, left libertarianism, is whether we should focus on the overlap with libertarians or leftists. And I'm curious what your thoughts on this are. Do you think we as the left libertarian movement find better allies in other socialists or other libertarians?
Yeah, I would say it depends. Which, geez, that's doesn't that just embody that context-keeping spirit? On a given issue, I might side with one more than the other. So, like, take for example, in the current system we have, I would rather have some form of public option or public healthcare system than not, given the current arrangement, right? In that case, a lot of, honestly, even some of our left market anarchist friends at C4SS wouldn't necessarily agree with me. And I could find plenty of bedfoes and the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, who obviously would be for that kind of a thing, at least in some form. They may be a little bit too rigid on it because, like, I would still be happy to have, say, a public option, even if it's not the kind of single payer system that Bernie Sanders supports. But they wouldn't be so hostile. Whereas I think a lot of libertarians and left market anarchists would just want it completely off the table, at least from my experience. Whereas in contrast, I do find a lot of democratic socialists who don't take the Gabriel Coco perspective seriously on just how problematic regulation can be and the degree to which it creates unnecessary barriers for your average person to be able to make a living for themselves and be able to creatively kind of make a living for themselves and have some free time and live their life the way they want to live it. And then you've got this bureaucratic welfare regulatory state that's constantly telling them what they can and can't do. And I think that democratic socialists tend to have a very weak criticism of that, if they have a criticism at all. Some of them are good on it. They'll say, like, we don't want the bureaucracy. That's why we want this more straightforward, kind of really robust welfare state. But even still, a lot of them are, I think, in my opinion, we talk about trigger happy. They're a bit too regulatory happy. That would be my response, is like, it just depends. What's the issue? I don't want to come right out the gate and go, I'm always going to side with this group over the other group, because that just doesn't seem to work out that way very well. Because once we look at these issues, and those were only two issues, we could talk about many others. But once we see that there's that, some issues, some are better than others, I can't commit to one over the other. I would want to work with someone who I think on the given issue I'm working with them on, they're going to do the best job at that time to I guess achieve better ends that would be an alignment that I would see would be better ends. But hopefully that kind of answers that question.
I think it totally does. I think it really touches upon the advantage of the I guess I call it the anarchist or autonomist approach versus the Marxist-Leninist approach, which is about, what are you focusing on, like some abstract political ideal, some abstract like collective thing that will lead us all to a new future, or are you focusing on the improvement and increasing cooperative control of just people's daily lives, and how parties can sometimes help that, organizations like DSA can sometimes help that, sometimes just individuals can help, but it's to focus on one is to ignore context, which is, again, the dialectical approach.
Absolutely.
On that note, is there anything we haven't covered in this interview you'd like to chat about?
Something I always like to ask, because I just like to know people's personal thoughts, like, is when you were reading my article, and I'm not doing this in like a self-promotional way, like I'm always just curious, like, people's thoughts on things that I say and critiques or things that they're like, wow, that stood out. I hadn't thought about that before, just so I can kind of get a sense of, like, what am I contributing and what am I, not really doing so well on. So, like, what were some of, like, the takeaways you had as you read the article?
Well, I think the thing that I definitely appreciated and agree with, and I think this is because we're both students of dialectical libertarianism, is this idea that it's context that matters. It's so much less about what your ideal is, even if ideals are really important as like inspirations. It's all about like, where are you? What do you have? How did it get there? And, what can we do to improve people's lives in that situation?
Mm-hmm.
And I've mentioned before, in a lot of situations that I'm much more um, sympathetic to the Marxist approach. I don't know if I could legitimately call myself a communist, but I definitely like class struggle and material analysis are really important to me. And I think that there's a certain emphasis that could be added to sort of there. It's like the struggle between the sort of like pluralism of just, it's whatever works in the particular situation, and this another sort of analysis, which is that, everything does have a sort of an underlying economic problem in terms of economic hierarchy. And I don't think you're saying that it doesn't have that, but I do think that there's this infinite tension between these two things of like pure pluralism and like a class struggle form of resistance. But I think that I think if it came down to it, our actual views would be pretty much the same in like most situations.
Yeah, no, I like how you put that. I think, and this is probably a weakness of the article because I didn't, there was so much I was wanting to address, and this came about through a couple of Facebook posts I made that were not actually threaded together initially, right? And so like after I'd written on it all, I was like, oh wow, I could put all this together and add to it and make it as a whole. And so there were things I definitely were going to miss. And so I would say the kind of pluralism I defend would not be just kind of this free flowing, let's just throw everything together and see what Frankenstein comes out of it. But you can certainly have a primacy of things or a rank ordering of things. And I think, if we're having a left wing analysis at all, class is going to come into it. I think even from the kind of some of the left libertarians we have at C4SS, Roderick Long has a class analysis, which isn't quite obviously Marxist, but it's still taking class seriously. And I'm not opposed to Marxism. So, I think if this article was rewritten again, I would probably, especially after discussing Marxism-Leninism, I probably would want to have a part where I discuss like Marxism and like the strengths I take away from it and that kind of a thing. Well, we'll get to that. I was going to say I might be writing about that in the future, but I know you'll probably ask me where you can read stuff by me, and so we'll get to that. But yeah.
Well, I'll say I hope if you do write something, you'll put it on C4SS, because I really think more conversations about the cross-pollination of left libertarianism and market anarchism and, broader leftist communist Marxist theory is really important, even if it's a critique. Like even just like engaging with these conversations is so important. But yes, my next question is, what's the best way for listeners to check out your work if they found this interview compelling?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can obviously go to C4SS and you'll find two articles of mine. One was called An Evolving Anarchism, which I wrote back in the summer of 2017, which I would say I've detracted a decent bit from since then. I was definitely a lot more rigidly left market anarchist at that point. So I was more hostile to social democratic things, even if I wasn't completely opposed to them. But there's still a lot of value to it. It's a very short little article. And I think it has a lot of, it points to tendencies that are still with me today, so it's useful to look at. But Market State and Anarchy is the big one that I came out with, and that was last year. So obviously you can read through that. You should if you're listening to this. But then I've just recently started up a Medium page. So it would just be Medium and then my name, Ryan Nugenbauer. And my first article, let me just make sure I'm not wrong about that. I think I'm right about that. Yeah. But my first article was a dialectical journey from religion to politics and elsewhere. And I really try to discuss my own personal evolution on issues of political thought, religious thought, and then also my own sexual orientation and such. And so I think it goes very well with the article that we were discussing today. And I'm hoping to write more articles, moving forward. The strength to it, having it on Medium, is I don't have to get it approved by anyone, and I'm not, this is no critique of C4SS, but if I submit an article to C4SS, someone starts looking through it and it's like, I think you should do this, or maybe they won't accept it. Like, it's an easier way for me to just, here are my thoughts, I'm putting it out there. But that said, that doesn't mean I'm not going to write for C4SS. I still would like to, when it seems like a topic I'm discussing would be applicable, that I could put it on C4SS as well. So,
well, I won't take it personally as the editing coordinator, but no, I think you're totally right. I mean, I would never be one to fault someone for subverting control. But, but Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the Enragé, and I hope to chat more with you in the future and see more work from you.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Have a good one.